The airport encounter. The airport was bustling with activity, a living, breathing organism of travelers moving to their destinations. The cacophony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps was an all-too-familiar symphony to Brigadier General Nya Harper. A commanding figure with piercing eyes and a purposeful stride, Nya wasn't just any passenger making her way through the terminal. She was a symbol of discipline, courage, and progress. But today, she was incognito, dressed in casual civilian attire, a fitted black blazer over a simple gray t-shirt, paired with dark jeans and comfortable sneakers. Nya's presence commanded attention even without her uniform. At 6 feet tall with a chiseled jawline and a regal bearing, she exuded an air of authority. Yet, she had learned long ago that her achievements and rank didn't shield her from the biases of the world. Her caramel skin and neatly braided hair often drew questions, silent or spoken, about whether she belonged in certain spaces. Today was no different. She walked with quiet confidence, but the unspoken weight of societal expectations rested on her shoulders as she headed toward the security checkpoint. She was on her way to a critical international summit, where she was slated to deliver a keynote address on leadership and inclusion in modern military strategy. As the first black woman to achieve the rank of brigadier general in her division, Nya was a trailblazer. Her speech was more than a professional obligation. It was a personal mission. She intended to challenge traditional notions of leadership and shine a light on the need for diversity within military ranks. But Nya wasn't thinking about her speech as she approached the airport security line. Instead, she focused on blending into the crowd. She preferred this anonymity during travel. Just another passenger, just another face in the sea of humanity. Her ID and boarding pass were ready in hand as she joined the queue, letting the ebb and flow of the crowd guide her. The line moved steadily, and when it was her turn, she handed her documents to the TSA agent. The young man, barely in his 20s, glanced at her ID, then did a double take. His eyes darted from the name on the card to her face, then back again. "Thank you, General Harper," he said, his voice a mix of respect and surprise. He handed back her documents with an awkward smile. Nya nodded curtly, offering a polite but non-committal acknowledgement. She was used to this reaction. The mix of astonishment and admiration that followed people discovering her rank. But she preferred when it ended there, without unnecessary fanfare or suspicion. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. She passed through the metal detectors without incident and quickly gathered her belongings from the conveyor belt. Slinging her leather duffel bag over her shoulder, she headed toward her gate, her mind already turning to the summit. She mentally rehearsed key points from her speech, her confidence unwavering. Years of military training had prepared her to handle pressure, but the topic of her address, diversity in the armed forces, was personal. It wasn't just about policy or strategy. It was about her lived experience. As she neared the gate, she noticed the line of passengers beginning to form. She checked her ticket, first class, and took her place. Around her, travelers chatted or scrolled through their phones, immersed in their own worlds. Nya stood quietly, her posture erect, her focus internal. But the calm of the moment was abruptly interrupted. "Excuse me, Mom," a voice called out. Nya turned to see a gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a pinched expression and a name tag that read Deborah. The woman was staring at her with thinly veiled skepticism. "Are you in the right line? This is for first-class passengers." Nya froze for a moment. The question was direct, yet loaded with an unspoken assumption. It wasn't the first time she'd been questioned in such a manner, and she doubted it would be the last. Still, each instant stung in its own way. Her jaw tightened as she fought to keep her composure. "Yes, I'm in the right line," she replied evenly, holding up her boarding pass for emphasis. Deborah's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at the pass, but instead of stepping aside, she said, "I'll need to see your ID as well." Nya's patience wavered but didn't break. With deliberate movements, she retrieved her military ID and handed it over. The gate agent studied the card, her lips pursed, her eyes flicking back to Naya's face as if searching for inconsistencies. "This will just take a moment," Deborah said, her tone clipped. She stepped away, leaving Naya standing there, a curious and uncomfortable silence settling over the line. Passengers around her began to notice the interaction. Some glanced over with curiosity. Others whispered to one another. Naya could feel their stares, their unspoken judgments. It was a sensation she knew all too well. The feeling of being on trial in the court of public opinion. Deborah returned a few minutes later, accompanied by a security officer. He was a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, his uniform pristine and his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Ma'am," he said, his tone neutral but firm, "we need to verify your credentials." Naya's patience snapped, though she kept her voice measured. "I've already provided my ID and my boarding pass. What more do you need?" The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Deborah, however, pressed on. "It's just standard procedure," she said, though her tone betrayed the unspoken bias beneath the words. "Standard for whom?" Naya shot back, her voice calm but sharp. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, no one spoke. The officer shifted uncomfortably, and Deborah's face flushed. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, passengers clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. Finally, the officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you'll just step aside, we can sort this out." Naya squared her shoulders, her voice steely. "I've complied with every request. I'm not stepping aside unless you can provide a valid reason for this delay. I'm Brigadier General Naya Harper, United States Marine Corps. If you need further verification, I suggest you contact your supervisor." The declaration stunned both Deborah and the officer into silence. The weight of Naya's rank, and the authority it carried, was undeniable. Yet she could see the doubt lingering in their eyes, the struggle to reconcile her appearance with her title. The confrontation had drawn a crowd, and Naya knew that every second of this ordeal was being scrutinized. Some passengers had even pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. She could feel their stares, the judgment in their eyes, but she refused to falter. Deborah muttered something under her breath and scurried off, presumably to find her supervisor. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, avoided making eye contact. Naya stood her ground, her posture unyielding, her expression resolute. She had faced bigger battles than this, but the sting of being questioned, of having to prove herself over and over again, never dulled. This wasn't just about a boarding pass, it was about the systemic biases that perpetuated these encounters. As she waited, her thoughts turned to the summit. Her speech suddenly felt even more urgent. She wasn't just advocating for change, she was living proof of why it was needed. The supervisor arrives. The tension in the air was thick as Brigadier General Naya Harper remained at the gate, her back straight and her expression calm. She had no intention of stepping aside, no matter how many uniformed personnel surrounded her. The crowd of travelers had grown quiet, the occasional murmur cutting through the silence as people speculated about what was happening. Phones hovered in the air, capturing the unfolding scene, but Naya didn't acknowledge them. She was focused on one thing, ensuring she boarded her flight without further humiliation. After what felt like an eternity, Deborah, the gate agent, returned with her supervisor. The woman was tall, with short-cropped gray hair and a tailored blazer that screamed authority. She exuded a professional demeanor, but Naya could tell she was already trying to diffuse the situation before she even spoke. "I'm Meredith, the station manager," the woman said, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been informed there's a concern regarding your boarding credentials, General Harper." She emphasized the title, perhaps hoping it would act as an olive branch. Naya returned the smile with an icy one of her own. "Concern is an interesting choice of words," she said. "I've provided my boarding pass, my military ID, and my full cooperation. What exactly is the issue?" Meredith glanced briefly at Deborah, who stood rigidly to the side, avoiding eye contact. The supervisor's brow furrowed as she tried to assess the situation. "It seems there was some confusion," she said, her tone measured. "We simply needed to verify." "Verify what?" Naya interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "My credentials are valid, my ticket is first class, and I've complied with every request. What more do you need?" Meredith's composed facade cracked slightly. She glanced around, noticing the crowd of onlookers and the numerous phones pointed in their direction. This wasn't just an internal issue anymore. It was a public relations disaster waiting to happen. "I assure you, General Harper, this is not a reflection on you," Meredith said, her voice lower now, as though trying to contain the damage. "We have protocols in place. Protocols that seem to disproportionately target people who look like me," Naya said pointedly, crossing her arms. The words hung in the air, cutting through the supervisor's rehearsed platitudes. Meredith stiffened. "That's not our intention, I assure you." "Intentions matter less than outcomes," Naya replied. "And the outcome here is clear. I've been singled out, questioned, and delayed without cause. If this is your idea of protocols, then your system needs serious reevaluation." Meredith opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sharp voice from the back of the crowd. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned to see a man in a sharply pressed suit striding toward them. His badge identified him as an airline executive, and his presence immediately shifted the energy of the room. Meredith straightened, visibly relieved. "Mr. Carraway, I was just addressing the issue." The man held up a hand, silencing her. He turned to Nya, his expression neutral but his eyes scanning her intently. "Ma'am, I'm John Carraway, Regional Director for the airline. I understand there's been a delay in your boarding process." "That's one way to describe it," Naya said, her voice steady. "Another way would be to call it what it is, an unnecessary and discriminatory interrogation." Carraway blinked, clearly caught off guard by her bluntness. He glanced at Meredith, who was now visibly squirming. "I see," he said slowly. "May I have a moment to review your documents?" Nia handed him her boarding pass and ID without hesitation. He examined them closely, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed the information. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing wrong with these credentials," he said, his voice firm. He turned to Meredith and Deborah. "Why was this passenger delayed?" Meredith hesitated, her professional demeanor faltering. "There was some uncertainty about the ID," she said weakly. "Uncertainty," Carraway repeated, his tone icy. "This ID is perfectly valid. There was no reason to escalate this situation." Naya's lips tightened as she watched Meredith shrink under her superior's glare. But her anger wasn't directed solely at the gate agent. It was the entire system. The unspoken biases, the coded language, the subtle ways people in power undermined those who didn't fit their narrow expectations. "I'd like a direct explanation," Naya said, her voice cutting through the momentary silence. "Because what I see is a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond this one incident. This isn't about a single mistake. This is about systemic failure." Carraway turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "General Harper, on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for this experience. I assure you, this is not how we conduct business." Nia arched an eyebrow. "Then why does it keep happening?" The question landed like a blow. Carraway had no immediate answer, and the weight of the silence that followed spoke volumes. Around them, the crowd of passengers murmured, some nodding in agreement. "I'll ensure this matter is investigated thoroughly," Carraway said finally, his voice stiff. "Investigating isn't enough," Naya replied. "Change the policies that allow this to happen in the first place." The executive's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You're absolutely right, and I'll make sure steps are taken to prevent this from happening again." Nia held his gaze for a moment before nodding. She didn't trust promises made in the heat of public embarrassment, but she knew she had made her point. "Am I clear to board my flight now?" she asked. Of course, Caraway said quickly, gesturing toward the gate. As she moved past the cluster of employees and onto the jet bridge, Naya felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her. She didn't turn to meet them, keeping her head high and her stride purposeful. She knew the battle wasn't over. Not here, not anywhere. But for now, she had won this small victory. Seated in first class moments later, Naya exhaled slowly, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally fading. She gazed out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff, her mind already shifting back to her upcoming speech. The summit was no longer just an opportunity to discuss policy. It was a stage to shine a light on the injustices she had faced, and that countless others continued to endure. Naya knew the fight for equity and respect was far from over, but she also knew she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The flight of reflection. As the plane ascended into the sky, Brigadier General Nya Harper leaned back in her first-class seat, trying to find solace in the hum of the engines. The confrontation at the gate was over, but its emotional residue lingered, clinging to her like an unwelcome shadow. Her sharp mind, honed by years of military service, replayed the incident in vivid detail. She analyzed every word, every glance, every micro-expression of doubt and condescension. Why had she been forced to defend her legitimacy yet again? Why did the weight of her accomplishments always seem to be overshadowed by the assumptions tied to her skin color and gender? The flight attendant's voice broke through her thoughts. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am?" Nia looked up, her expression softening. The attendant, a young woman with an earnest smile, seemed genuinely kind. "Just water, please," Nia replied, her voice steady but fatigued. The attendant nodded and returned moments later with a glass of water. Naya thanked her and took a small sip, her throat dry from the tension earlier. She glanced around the cabin, noticing a few of the passengers who had witnessed the gate altercation. Some offered her tentative smiles, while others quickly averted their gaze. Nia wasn't looking for validation from them. She had learned long ago that the opinions of strangers were fleeting and superficial. What mattered was the integrity she carried within herself and the respect she commanded in her field. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes for her speech at the summit. The words she had prepared were meant to inspire, to challenge her audience to think beyond the narrow confines of traditional military leadership. But now, in the wake of the morning's events, the speech felt inadequate. Diversity isn't just a concept, she thought, tapping her pen against the page. It's a necessity, a survival strategy for any institution that wants to thrive in a complex world. Her pen moved swiftly, crossing out sections, rewriting paragraphs, adding new insights. The gate incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a microcosm of the systemic issues she had faced her entire career. She decided to incorporate this personal experience into her speech, not as a story of victimhood, but as a powerful example of the barriers that needed to be dismantled. Memories of battles fought. As Naya wrote, her mind wandered back to the early days of her career. She remembered the grueling months of basic training, where she had stood out not just because she was one of the few women in her cohort, but because she was a black woman in a space dominated by white men. There had been whispers in the barracks, side glances during drills, and moments of outright hostility. "You sure you can handle this, Harper?" one of her instructors had asked during a particularly grueling exercise. "Yes, sir," she had replied without hesitation, even as her muscles burned and her lungs begged for air. She had handled it all right. She hadn't just survived. She had excelled. But it had come at a cost. She had to be twice as good, twice as resilient, and twice as composed to earn half the respect. As the years went by, Naya's reputation grew. She became known as a brilliant strategist, a decisive leader, and an unyielding advocate for her troops. But no matter how high she climbed, the doubts followed her. She had faced countless gatekeepers, both literal and figurative, who questioned her right to stand where she did. The memories were a bittersweet reminder of how far she had come, and how far society still had to go. A mid-flight interruption. Her reflections were interrupted when the man seated across the aisle leaned toward her. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in a crisp suit, and had an air of self-importance about him. "Excuse me," he began, his tone polite but laced with curiosity. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened back at the gate. Are you really a general?" Nia looked at him, her expression neutral. "Yes, I am," she said simply. He nodded, as if processing this information. "Impressive," he said after a moment. "I don't think I've ever met a general before. And to be honest, I wouldn't have expected." He trailed off, clearly realizing the implication of his words. Nia arched an eyebrow. "Wouldn't have expected what?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. The man flushed. "Oh, I just meant, you're so young. And well, you're not what I picture when I think of a general." Nia's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she said. "People's expectations are often based on outdated assumptions. That's exactly what I'm working to change." The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat but nodded. "I see. Well, thank you for your service." Nia inclined her head in acknowledgement but didn't say anything further. She had heard similar comments countless times, and she wasn't in the mood to educate this particular stranger. Instead, she returned to her notebook, her pen moving with renewed determination. A broader perspective. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Nia allowed herself a moment to gaze out the window. The endless expanse of clouds stretched beneath her, a serene contrast to the turbulence she had faced that morning. She thought about the summit and the audience that awaited her, generals, admirals, and defense officials from around the world. Many of them were old-school leaders who viewed diversity as a box to check rather than a transformative force. But Nia wasn't there to pander or placate. She was there to challenge them, to make them uncomfortable, to force them to confront the blind spots that had held their institutions back for decades. Her message wasn't just about representation, it was about survival. The modern battlefield demanded agility, innovation, and a deep understanding of diverse perspectives. Homogeneity was a liability, and the stakes were too high to cling to outdated models of leadership. The general's resolve. By the time the plane began its descent, Nia had rewritten large portions of her speech. It was sharper now, more direct, and infused with the fire of her convictions. She was ready to stand before the summit and deliver her message with the authority and authenticity that only someone who had lived it could provide. As the plane touched down, Nia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation at the gate had been a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also reinforced her resolve. She wasn't just a passenger on a plane or a speaker at a summit. She was a force for change, and she wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, stand in her way. The summit's first challenge. As the summit's venue loomed into view, Brigadier General Nia Harbour felt a familiar rush of anticipation. The grand building was an architectural marvel, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the bright midday sun. It stood as a symbol of progress and power, a fitting backdrop for the gathering of military leaders and policymakers from around the globe. Nia stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the polished stone walkway. She had changed into her dress uniform during the ride from the airport, a deep green jacket adorned with medals and insignias that reflected a career of excellence and sacrifice. The transformation was striking. Gone was the casual traveler who had been scrutinized and doubted at the airport. In her place stood a commanding figure who demanded respect with every step. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Attendees mingled in the grand atrium, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional clink of glasses. Nia moved through the crowd with purpose, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. She spotted a few colleagues, their nods of acknowledgement filled with genuine admiration. But not everyone shared that sentiment. The whispered doubts. As Nia approached the check-in desk, she noticed two senior officers standing nearby, their heads bent together in hushed conversation. Both men were white, their uniforms immaculate, their postures exuding the confidence of those who had long occupied positions of power. "She's the keynote," one of them whispered, his voice dripping with incredulity. "I don't see how she's qualified to speak on this topic, diversity and inclusion. Since when is that a priority in combat strategy?" The other officer chuckled. "It's all politics these days. They're just ticking boxes. I doubt she has anything new to say." Nia heard every word but didn't break stride. Years of enduring such comments had taught her how to channel her anger into determination. She walked past the men without so much as a glance, her head held high. If they doubted her, so be it. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to speak the truth. The opening session. The conference room was as imposing as the building itself. Rows of plush chairs faced a massive stage, where a digital screen displayed the summit's theme: Leadership in a Changing World. Nia took her seat in the front row, reserved for speakers and distinguished guests. Around her, high-ranking officials and dignitaries settled in, their conversations growing quieter as the session prepared to begin. The moderator, a polished civilian with a background in defense policy, welcomed the attendees and introduced the first speaker. It was General Douglas Harrington, a towering figure in the military community and a staunch traditionalist. As Harrington took the stage, Nia couldn't help but feel a pang of irritation. His name alone carried enough weight to command attention, but his views often clashed with the very principles he was there to advocate. Harrington's speech was eloquent but predictable, emphasizing the importance of discipline, tradition, and maintaining the core values that had defined military success for decades. He spoke at length about the dangers of diluting standards and prioritizing optics over operational readiness. Nia listened intently, her expression neutral, but her mind churned with rebuttals. She could already anticipate the challenges she would face when it was her turn to speak. The encounter with opposition. During the break, Nia found herself cornered by General Harrington and a small group of like-minded officers. Harrington greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "General Harper," he said, his tone overly cordial. "Looking forward to your keynote. I'm curious to hear your perspective." Always good to have fresh voices in the conversation. Nia matched his smile, though hers was razor-sharp. "Thank you, General. I'm looking forward to sharing insights based on lived experience and modern research. I believe this conversation is long overdue." Harrington's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, just remember, tradition has its place. The military isn't a social experiment. We've been successful for centuries for a reason." Nia's smile didn't waver. And yet, the world is changing. Leadership that doesn't adapt to new realities risks becoming obsolete. I think we can all agree that's a risk we can't afford. Harrington's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of those nearby. Nia didn't mind. She had planted her flag in the conversation, and she wasn't about to retreat. The keynote address. When it was finally Nia's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She climbed the steps to the stage with measured grace, her uniform catching the light as she approached the podium. The digital screen behind her now displayed her name and title: Brigadier General Nia Harper, keynote speaker. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "Today, I stand before you not just as a leader, but as someone who has walked the path of change, a path that is neither easy nor comfortable, but absolutely necessary." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "For too long, we have equated tradition with strength and change with weakness. But the truth is, adaptability has always been the key to survival. Whether on the battlefield or in the boardroom, those who fail to evolve are left behind." Nia spoke with passion and precision, weaving personal anecdotes with data and case studies. She recounted moments from her career when diverse teams had outperformed their homogeneous counterparts, their varied perspectives leading to innovative solutions. But she didn't shy away from the harder truths. She spoke about the biases she had faced, the systemic barriers that still existed, and the cost of ignoring them. Diversity is not about ticking boxes, she said, her voice rising with conviction. It's about harnessing the full potential of our people. It's about recognizing that leadership comes in many forms, and that strength is found in unity, not uniformity. As she concluded, the room erupted into applause. Not polite clapping, but a genuine, thunderous response. Naya scanned the crowd, noting the expressions of those who had doubted her earlier. Some looked thoughtful, others uncomfortable. A few even looked inspired. The aftermath. As Naya stepped off the stage, she was immediately surrounded by attendees who wanted to speak with her. Some offered congratulations, others asked thoughtful questions, and a few admitted that her speech had challenged their preconceptions. But it was Harrington's reaction that surprised her the most. He approached her quietly, his expression unreadable. "You made some good points," he said gruffly. "Doesn't mean I agree with all of them, but you've given me something to think about." Nia inclined her head. "That's all I ask, General. Change starts with a conversation." He nodded once before walking away, leaving Nia with a small but significant sense of victory. As the day progressed, Nia felt the weight of her mission lifting slightly. The summit wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step forward, a chance to shift the narrative, even if just a little. And that, she knew, was how real change began. The backroom conversations. After delivering her powerful keynote address, Brigadier General Nia Harper felt the familiar surge of post-speech adrenaline. The applause had been overwhelming, and the conversations that followed were filled with a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and resistance. She had expected no less. Challenging entrenched systems always provoked a spectrum of reactions. As the formal sessions of the day concluded, the attendees were ushered into a sprawling reception area. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and soft classical music played in the background. Uniformed servers moved gracefully through the crowd, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and sparkling glasses of champagne. Nia nursed a glass of sparkling water as she navigated the room, her presence drawing attention wherever she went. Some smiled and nodded, eager to engage with her. Others avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the truths she had laid bare during her speech. The quiet ally. Near the edge of the room, Nia found herself in a conversation with Colonel Elena Vasquez, a respected intelligence officer known for her analytical brilliance and progressive mindset. Vasquez was one of the few attendees who had openly championed diversity initiatives in the military. "Nia," Vasquez began, her tone low but earnest, "your speech was exactly what this summit needed. You didn't just speak to the room, you challenged it." Nia smiled. "That was the goal, but I know not everyone is ready to hear it." "They'll come around," Vasquez said. "They have to. The world is changing faster than they realize. And if we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." Before Nia could respond, their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour." Nia turned to see General Douglas Harrington approaching, a glass of whiskey in hand. His tone was genial, but his eyes held a glint of challenge. "General Harrington," Nia greeted, her voice calm and measured. "I'll admit," he began, "you've got a way with words. You had the entire room hanging on your every syllable. That's no small feat." Nia nodded politely. "Thank you, General." "But," Harrington continued, his tone sharpening, "I still question the practicality of what you're proposing. Diversity and inclusion sound great on paper, but out in the field, what matters is competence and discipline. The battlefield doesn't care about representation." Nia's smile remained steady, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Respectfully, General, the battlefield cares very much about adaptability and innovation, both of which are enhanced by diverse perspectives. Competence and discipline are not mutually exclusive with representation. In fact, they're strengthened by it." Harrington scoffed, taking a sip of his drink. "That's a nice theory, but I've been in this business long enough to know that tradition exists for a reason. Tradition is important, Naya agreed, her tone firm, but it should never be a barrier to progress. The world we operate in today is not the same world you trained for 30 years ago. If we cling to outdated models, we risk becoming obsolete. Their exchange had drawn a small crowd, other attendees subtly inching closer to listen. Harrington seemed to notice and straightened his posture, as if preparing for a debate. And what happens when your so-called diversity initiatives lower the standards? When we prioritize quotas over qualifications? Naya's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Let me be clear. Diversity is not about lowering standards. It's about recognizing talent in all its forms and ensuring that opportunities are accessible to everyone. If you think inclusion and excellence are mutually exclusive, then perhaps the real issue is how we've defined excellence in the first place. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Harrington's face flushed, but he said nothing further. He gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving Naya standing tall in the center of the room. The unexpected connection. As the evening progressed, Naya found herself approached by an unexpected figure, Admiral Marcus Egan, a seasoned Navy officer with a reputation for being pragmatic but reserved on social issues. General Harper, he said, his deep voice carrying a note of respect. May I have a word? Of course, Admiral, Naya replied, her curiosity piqued. They moved to a quieter corner of the room, away from the bustling crowd. Egan took a moment to collect his thoughts before speaking. I'll admit, he began, I wasn't entirely convinced by your argument during the keynote, but I've been thinking about something you said, about the cost of ignoring diverse perspectives. Nya tilted her head, listening intently. Egan continued, a few years ago, my team was working on a critical mission in the Pacific. We ran into a logistical problem that none of us could solve. It was one of our junior officers, a young woman from a non-traditional background, who came up with the solution. If we'd ignored her input, the mission might have failed. Nia smiled. That's exactly the point, Admiral. Talent and innovation often come from unexpected places, but we can only harness it if we're willing to listen and create an environment where all voices are valued. Egan nodded slowly. You've given me a lot to think about, General, and I appreciate that. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Naya felt a flicker of hope. Change, she knew, often started with small shifts in perspective. The after-action report. By the end of the night, Naya was exhausted but resolute. The summit had been a battlefield of its own, filled with microaggressions, open challenges, and subtle victories. But she had held her ground, her voice unwavering amidst the noise. As she returned to her hotel room, she reflected on the day's events. She thought about Harrington's resistance, Vasquez's support, and Egan's surprising openness. Each interaction was a piece of the larger puzzle, a puzzle she was determined to solve. Sitting at the small desk in her room, Nya opened her notebook and began jotting down notes for the next day's sessions. The fight for inclusion and equity wasn't a single battle. It was a sustained campaign, one that required strategy, resilience, and an unwavering belief in the cause. Naya paused, her pen hovering over the page. She thought about the young soldiers and officers who looked up to her, who saw in her a reflection of what they could become. They were her motivation, her reason for fighting. With a deep breath, she closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about all the voices that had been silenced, all the potential that had gone unnoticed, and all the barriers that needed to be broken. And Naya Harper wasn't just breaking barriers, she was building bridges, a legacy in motion. The next morning, Brigadier General Nya Harper awoke to sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains of her hotel room. The glow was warm, almost comforting, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relish the quiet. But the tranquility didn't last long. Her mind quickly shifted to the day ahead, her resolve as sharp as ever. Today was the summit's most critical session, a roundtable discussion where attendees would present actionable strategies based on the previous day's speeches. Naya knew this would be the moment when support, or opposition, would crystallize. The stakes were high, but she was prepared. Dressed once again in her pristine uniform, she arrived at the venue early. The grand conference room was arranged in a circular layout, fostering a sense of collaboration among the participants. The air buzzed with energy as military leaders, policymakers, and academics filed in, their voices a low hum of anticipation. Nia took her designated seat near the head of the table. To her left sat General Harrington, his expression guarded but not openly hostile. To her right was Admiral Marcus Egan, who greeted her with a respectful nod. Across from her was Colonel Elena Vasquez, her quiet ally from the previous day. The moderator opened the session with a brief recap of the keynote address and the previous discussions. Today, he said, we will focus on turning ideas into action. General Harper, given the impact of your speech, we'd like you to start the conversation. Taking the lead, Nia leaned forward, her gaze steady as she addressed the room. Thank you, she began. Yesterday, I spoke about the need for adaptability and inclusion in modern military leadership. Today, I want to focus on how we can implement these principles in tangible ways. She outlined 3 key initiatives. Recruitment reform. Nia proposed expanding outreach efforts to underrepresented communities, not as a gesture of charity, but as a strategic investment in untapped talent. We're missing out on brilliant minds simply because we aren't looking in the right places, she said. Mentorship programs. She emphasized the importance of mentorship in retaining diverse talent, suggesting formalized programs that paired experienced leaders with emerging ones. Leadership isn't just about command, she said. It's about cultivating the next generation. Cultural competency training. Nia called for mandatory training to address unconscious biases and foster a culture of respect within the ranks. Our strength lies in our unity, she said, and unity requires understanding. As she spoke, she noticed a mix of reactions around the table. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Others, like Harrington, remained impassive, their skepticism evident. The pushback. When Nia finished, Harrington was the first to respond. His tone was measured but firm. General Harper, your proposals are ambitious, but I'm concerned about the unintended consequences. Expanding recruitment efforts is one thing, but lowering standards to achieve diversity is a dangerous precedent. Nia's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. Respectfully, General, no one is suggesting lowering standards. Excellence is non-negotiable. What I'm proposing is ensuring that excellence isn't defined by a narrow set of criteria that excludes capable individuals. Another officer chimed in. But how do we measure success? How do we know these initiatives will improve readiness and not just create unnecessary friction within the ranks? Nia leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, but her gaze unwavering. We measure success the same way we always have, by results. Diverse teams have consistently been shown to outperform homogeneous ones in both military and civilian settings. This isn't a theory, it's a fact backed by data. The shift. As the discussion continued, Nia noticed a subtle shift in the room. Admiral Egan spoke up, lending his support to her mentorship proposal. I've seen firsthand how mentorship can transform careers, he said. This is an initiative worth pursuing. Colonel Vasquez added her voice to the conversation, sharing examples from her own experience where diversity had directly contributed to mission success. It's not about optics, she said. It's about capability. And capability comes in many forms. Even some of the more skeptical attendees began to soften, their questions becoming less combative and more inquisitive. Nia seized the opportunity to address their concerns, responding with a combination of data, personal anecdotes, and unwavering conviction. The unexpected ally. Toward the end of the session, General Harrington surprised everyone by speaking up again. I still have reservations, he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "But I'll admit, General Harper, you've made a compelling case. If we're going to move forward, it has to be with careful planning and accountability." Nia nodded, recognizing the significance of his words. While it wasn't a full endorsement, it was a step in the right direction. Closing the circle, the session concluded with a unanimous agreement to pilot the initiatives Nia had proposed. A task force was formed to oversee their implementation, and Nia was appointed as its chair. As the attendees filed out of the room, Nia felt a sense of accomplishment. The battle wasn't over, but progress had been made. A lasting impression. That evening, Nia stood on the terrace of the venue, gazing out at the city lights. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the challenges, the doubts, the triumphs. She thought about the young officers who would benefit from the changes she was fighting for, officers who might never know her name but would feel the impact of her work. As the cool night air brushed against her face, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready. Because for Brigadier General Nia Harper, leadership wasn't just about commanding troops or delivering speeches. It was about leaving a legacy of inclusion, resilience, and unwavering belief in the power of progress. And that legacy was only just beginning.